Hey Rachel, how you doing? I think the first thing that we're seeing here is the misplaced mean line. Okay, so that mean line, that's not a mean line. A mean line, of course, is the x height. It's a line that runs across the x height of the lowercase letters. So that mean is not a true mean line. So you'll definitely want to draw, and we can see that that is part of the assignment is to begin by drawing a baseline, mean line, and cap line. And again, same thing as last week. That doesn't make a lot of sense because you can't draw the mean line until you place a lowercase letter, right? So what I would recommend is this: is I would recommend you lay your baseline, place your uppercase F, okay, then go ahead and lay your cap line. All right, make sure those are perfectly parallel, and then place a lowercase letter, a couple lowercase letters, and then you can place your mean line just to establish consistency throughout the rest of the words. The right now this is not a cap line. This is way above the cap line. So the lines are placed incorrectly. So you definitely want to address that. Make sure that that's a perfectly straight line. I don't mind if you use a T-square to establish that perfectly horizontal baseline, because that's really going to establish the rest of your measurements for the words. Okay, so and again, it's so important that once you establish that baseline, that the mean line and cap line are both perfectly parallel with that baseline. No fluctuations at all, because that's really going to throw off the placement of the letters. All right. I think that one thing that you've done here very, very successfully is the word spacing. So the space between fire and the space between and ice, I think is done very, very well, so that the eye perceives this as a phrase and not three words. If these are wider apart, we can see that if this was a wider space right here, this word would be off on its own, and it would force the mind to create a little break. So let's say this was a really wide space between fire and. The mind would read fire and ice, as opposed to fire and ice. So I think you've done a great job with your word spacing. Letter spacing is a little different here. I think you're really loosely kerned in your letter spacing, which is a phenomenon that's not, it's quite common when students first start working with letter spacing with kerned letters. I'm sorry, with serif typeface. Working with kerning with serif typeface, the tendency is to want to bring them wider apart to keep those serifs separated, but that's not necessarily a good thing. So once you realize that those serifs they can be very, very close to each other. They can even touch in some cases, and that's called a ligature. And that's from our reading. Ligatures are fine in titles and magazine titles and headlines, but you don't really want ligatures in body copy because that impedes expeditious reading of the type. So let's talk about spacing, then we'll talk about craft. So we talked about word spacing. Let's talk about letter spacing. The distance between F and I, the kerning here is really wide, so you want to close that down. Not so much that that tittle of the I is touching the F. You don't want that, but you can bring that pretty close. That'll establish your spacing. The fire and the I and R in fire, again, is a little too wide. And once you bring that I over, you're going to want to bring the rest of those letters over. I think that you can bring that E a little closer to the R, so that can be completely tightened. I think that these two letters are kerned pretty nicely, A and N. Right now, that's not a true vertical. I think that we'll talk about craft in a second, but it appears, though, since this is kind of on a diagonal right here, it appears that that kerning right there is much wider than it actually is. So that's got to be a true vertical right there. The D is really far from the N, really far. So much so that if we look at the word and alone, it looks like two letters together, A and N, and then a D off by itself, right? And we don't want that. We want those to appear very, very consistent. So we've got to get that D tucked in there. Ice looks pretty good. I think the distance between the C and the E is pretty good. If you can tighten that down a little bit, that could definitely get pulled in a little bit there. Okay, so in summary for spacing, your word spacing is great. Your letter spacing is really loose, so you'll want to close that down a little bit. Now, a word on craft, I would say that for your final submission, just go ahead and really pay attention to the shapes of these letters. I mean, we take a look at the A, we can see that kind of dips in. That's on a diagonal right there, whereas this is looks like it's a perfect vertical. So you definitely want to represent that. The N right here, this stem of the N is much thinner than this stem. A couple of other inconsistencies in just the way that the curves, the mechanics of the curves. And so you really want to just really, really pay attention to craft. Get those letters perfect for your final submission. Also, the way they're sitting on the baseline is inconsistent. We can see the I is much higher on the baseline than the R or the E. Okay, and then also that D is way above the baseline as well. So you'll want to watch that. The C and the E are also a little bit above the baseline. Try to show overshoot on the baseline in your letter forms. I think that's really going to be effective as well. Okay, so those are my recommendations moving into your final submission. If you have any questions at all, Rachel, please feel free to let me know. But I'm looking forward to seeing your final. So again, great start. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks, Rachel.